So, our daily devotionals are a little off track. These last few weeks have been busy in ways I did not anticipate, and I apologize for the delay in getting these up in a timely manner. That said, today we're looking at a third key to reading the Bible, and that key is themes. I love Sunday school, and I think it does a lot of good in creating some biblical literacy in younger kids, helping them to have familiarity with the people and places that are found in the Bible. And that's not just a good thing, it's a great thing. The downfall of Sunday school is that many of the stories within Scripture are treated as separate and unconnected tableaus. Each story wraps up neatly and has a moral in and of itself. Sometimes that's effective, but more often, the Bible is written in such a way that books cover larger themes that weave through the individual stories of a particular book. Let me give you an example. When we read the book of Genesis, we see at the beginning that God creates the heavens and the earth and populates his creation with the various elements that make them what they are. This is the first chapter, and it's often treated either as one class or as a series of 7 classes. Treated separately, but often in close proximity, is chapter 2 and 3, which describe a more intimate creation of humanity and the introduction of the consequences of sin. Now, over the next 7 chapters of this book, we see a recurring theme of mankind rejecting God's wisdom, embracing a state of being that is contrary to his will, and ultimately falling again. We also see that some of the heavenly beings reject God's wisdom, embracing a state of being that is contrary to his will, and they fall. Does that mean that the first fall, found in Genesis chapter 3, wasn't a singular event? No, but it does tell us that there is more to these 6 chapters than a story about creation, a story about a snake and an apple, a story about 2 brothers, a story about a flood, a story about, in chapter 11, a tower. These stories are about 2 things: properly understanding God's place in the order of things and the consequences that come through the rejection of the way in which God has made us to fit into his creation. And as we read these books in bigger chunks, asking why they were written, we begin to see patterns that emerge, themes that are intended to help us to understand the story of Scripture, the story that God is telling. So continuing on with these examples from Genesis, let's think about what the beginning tells us about the rest of the book of Genesis and the rest of Scripture as a whole. Chapters 1 and 2 tell us that there is order and reason to God's creation, and that when creation works in harmony with God's intent, it is very good. Chapter 2 tells us specifically that God has a special place for humanity, a role for them to serve with co-stewardship over a garden he's given them. God is still in charge, but he invites humanity into his work and gives them a place in creation. Chapter 3 tells us that in the face of temptation, people rejected God's authority and claimed something other than what God wanted for them: wisdom from outside of God. Chapter 4 continues this theme, with humanity not just choosing their own source of wisdom, but claiming the right to end the lives of other human beings. A brother kills his brother in a fit of rage. And chapter 5 tells us that the consequence of these continued rejections of God's place over creation and man's place in creation spiraled through generations. Chapter 6 reveals that mankind is not alone in rejecting God's place for them, but even a group called the Sons of God had rejected their place. It's in this place, far from the original design God had intended, with no sense of purpose, that humanity was, they had descended into only evil always. God sends a flood as a means of essentially rebooting the machine towards something new in chapters 7 through 10. And if we read these chapters without the theme of humanity's struggle with God's place and embracing his will for them playing in our minds, we might be tempted to think that the story of the flood was God's ultimate solution to the problem of humanity's sin. But then we get to chapter 11 and we find the story of the Tower of Babel, and again, even after the flood, humanity rejects God and embraces their own will over his. And of course, this doesn't end in chapter 11. This is a primary theme of the book of Genesis, but the story becomes far more focused on this wrestling in the lives of individuals: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the sons of Jacob. The book of Genesis tells us that humanity's rejection of God's place and his will in our lives is not a new problem. It is the origin of all problems. And if we read it in that light, we begin to see that there is a second theme underlying that theme, a deeper meaning. If humanity is rejecting God, and it's a consistent pattern, only an absolute agreement between God and a man, a correct ordering of place and will, can undo the problem. And if we read all of Scripture in light of that theme, we should constantly be looking for the one person who will get this order and valuation of God's will right every time. There are many other themes in Scripture. Many of them are uncovered in the careful reading of the books of the Bible. But there are also many great resources on thematic Scripture reading that you can access for yourself. And today I'll recommend a series called The Bible Project, which has many theme videos that unpack these themes and show how they can be seen weaving through both individual books of the Bible and Scripture as a whole. I love you. And I pray today that you would find yourself prepared to embrace the Bible as a unified story, not disjointed stories, but a unified story that helps you understand your place in God's creation and God's place in the order of all things.